All okay. I just started recording. I'm going to share my screen, and I'll just talk you through what we're going to be doing. So hopefully you can all see my screen. Could someone just let me know if you could see my screen? Yeah.
All good, John.
Yeah. Well, so listen, you're both very, very welcome. This is a report that myself and Sean Fearon, who will be speaking first, we were commissioned to do this by the UK100 organisation, which essentially is, one of the leading organisations in the UK trying to push for more urgent, aggressive, at-scale climate action, particularly at the local level. And so it's going to be a game of two halves, in the sense Sean is going to speak for the first part of the presentation about the quantifiable economic benefits of local climate action, and be particularly interesting to yourself, Jacqueline, in a way. And this is probably as a prelude to perhaps further discussions that we can have later on. Sean will also look at some examples of cities and what cities could be doing in terms of, again, particular forms of decarbonisation or nature-based solutions. That's the climate mitigation in the language of climate politics. Mitigation, basically stopping burning fossil fuels, moving away from carbon-based energy to renewable energy, and adaptation are things, how do we adapt our infrastructure, our homes, our communities to inevitable climate change? Because the reality is we have simply pumped up too much carbon and other greenhouse gases that we are going to have to deal with an inevitable degree of climate change or climate breakdown, depending on the word you want to use. So we need to invest both in mitigation, removing carbon from the energy mix, and also then looking at climate adaptation. So I'll hand it over to you, Sean.
Great. Do you want to go next slide? And again. Yeah, lovely. So thank you, John. As I said, this presentation will be in two parts. I look at some of the more sort of specific economic benefits that we'd pull together. This wasn't a sort of work of primary research. We weren't out, collecting interview data or anything like that there from people on the ground in the constituencies and the local authorities that we're looking at. So we basically just took a few months and pulled together much of what is out there by way of economic benefits done by ENGOs, trade unions, and the state themselves. So what we have here is a summary of some of the key insights to do it, and in the next sort of slides we'll look at the way that we've broken down the report and some of the main sort of topics that we'll be hitting. But some of the key insights were investment in climate action at the local level would see over 800,000 green jobs across the UK by 2030, and that would rise to just below 1.4 million by 2050. Now, much of that is concentrated, as we'll see later on, in retrofitting in the construction industry and so on, where there's plenty of opportunities. But one of the things, and John will probably touch about it in his comments as well, that look, this is often seen as a cost. A lot of it, we wanted to focus on local authorities and what they could be doing within their local authority, that the powers that are available to them. But it is often seen as a cost, which puts it on down the line as an economic decision. But it is an investment, and particularly, as John said, it's an investment in adaptation and mitigation. For every £1 that is invested in mitigation, a further 9 is saved from the impacts of extreme weather events. So a massive saving investing now, and that's from the National Audit Office. If UK businesses reduce carbon emissions to net zero by 2030 instead of 2050, there could be, again, an escape of a cost equivalent to just over £1 trillion. Now, there are many ways of approaching this, but the point here is that the sooner and the quicker we act, the more benefits that we'll be able to realise, and that's a trend that's running through most of the report. And finally, a piece from the Grantham Institute: 1 in 5 workers, or about 6.3 million jobs in total, will be affected by the transition to net zero carbon economy. That's about 3 million that will, I suppose, in less demand, right? Because they're in sectors that are maybe more carbon intensive, or their skills are less relevant and therefore require upskilling. And 3 million that will be in higher demand, where there's greater employment opportunity. So some of the trends, the way we sort of structured this was, first of all, looking at emissions trends over the sort of short to medium term across UK local authorities, and then trying to identify the economic opportunities that would be available by decarbonising within different sectors. So one of the key things that was coming through a wee bit incongruously, we'll actually look at the second bullet point first. The three major sources of emissions across local authorities are industrial and commercial, domestic and transport. But from 2005 to 2018, industrial and commercial emissions have fallen sharply by about 45%, largely due to a shift away of extremely carbon-intensive industry and the closure of some of those industries in the north of England and in Wales. Domestic emissions have also fallen as houses have become more fuel efficient, but transport emissions have been extremely stagnant. They've dropped by only 7%. Now, the insight here is that look, some of the easier wins by way of decarbonisation may have already been won, and the things that require either significant investment or serious social or habitual change will take a good bit longer. And that fact, I suppose, is evidenced by the fact that the largest source of emissions for over half of all local authorities in the UK was the transport sector. So transport is a major source of decarbonisation. Now, the third point there, we're looking at land use. So Argyll and Bute, the Highlands and Northumberland, they're obviously a source of massive place of wilderness across the UK and place of natural majesty. But what I suppose the insight there is that the way that land is used and deliberately used, and it isn't, I suppose, deforested or overexploited by way of tourism or anything like that, means that they have a massive negative emissions effect. Now, the interesting point there, we'll maybe see in the next slide, is that there are other parts of between Britain and the north and the UK that have, I suppose, net emissions because of the extremely intensive agricultural way that land is used. So I suppose that's just maybe an outlier given some of the benefits that are available. So as I say, there are a small and declining number of extremely high industrial and commercial emissions, local authorities, again, based on large local installations. And there is a strong divergence in regional terms. I think that's on the next slide, John. So some of the regional insights we picked up. London has the lowest CO2 per capita emissions of any region due to the urban nature, and this is by and large not London as a city now, but many of its local authority areas where there are significant places of population and not business, like the City of London local authority, for example, and where there's a high population density and a relatively low level of large industrial emissions. Now, that's not to say there's a major decarbonisation challenge there and therefore economic opportunities, but just due to the density, the lower emissions intensity is clear. As I said, Northern Ireland has the highest land use change in forestry emissions because of the extremely intensive way land is used for agriculture. Wales per capita emissions are higher compared to other regions due to many of, like Neath Port Talbot, as we'll see later on, presence of really large industrial sites. And what was actually quite interesting, even though emissions are still quite high, when looking at the industrial and commercial sector in Yorkshire and Humber, there are massive economic opportunities to be realised there, given the scale of the manufacturing operation in and around the likes of Leeds and Sheffield and so on. And again, you're looking at territorial UK emissions by sector on the right-hand side, transport really coming through, and then to a lesser extent, you're looking at the major energy supply, business and residential. So this is another insight we picked out, again, looking at the emissions trends. So looking at domestic emissions, we'd rank them 1 to 10 based on gross emissions, right, from the top 10 emitting local authorities in domestic emissions. On the right-hand side then of that table, you're also looking at how closely much of those local authorities correlate with extremely high rates of fuel poverty. So again, social and economic benefits to be realised there by decarbonising, but just to see that 8 basically of the top 10 gross emitting were also in the highest rates of fuel poverty, which was an interesting trend. Again, just looking at some of these standouts, as I said, the City of London local authority has quite high emissions per capita, but that's, I suppose, a distorting figure just because it's got lower population within that local authority. And Neath Port Talbot in North Lincolnshire, where there are major industrial installations, and you can see them as the highest in the gross emissions as well, are the major by capita. You're also looking then at the bottom of the total emissions. Birmingham was the largest domestic emitting local authority as well. You would have seen that in the previous slide. And so again, opportunities there to decarbonise through retrofitting and so on, and climate action at the local level. So the economic benefits then that suppose correlate with some of those trends, we had looked at them through a number of lenses. So first of all, cost avoidance. As we said, investing now can save you greater costs through adaptation and mitigation down the line. The falling costs of decarbonisation are also a factor now, so that the more we do at the moment, the cheaper these technologies get into the future. So it's all about seizing the initiative in the present. Productivity as well is impacted by the fact that green energy can be cheaper, or that low energy bills can be lower, and we've seen a trend where productivity can be aided for small businesses through climate action and through some of these retrofitting schemes. The same for employment and value-added multipliers. Now, as I said, the main sort of approach that we've taken was using the main economic benefits that correspond with the main emissions profile. So that was, as we've just pointed out, domestic transport. And then we looked at the economic and social and health benefits for each of those: domestic transport, industrial and land use. So some of the direct economic benefits, we said investment in climate action at the local level could see 800,000 jobs delivered across by the UK by 2030 and up to 1.4 million by 2050. Local government can and should and it will be a key driver of the race to net zero, and that's again where our focus was, looking at economic action that can be taken in the local level. We've talked about the mitigation point there, and again some of those points mentioned on the first slide. Go ahead, John. So a wee bit more then on cost avoidance. As we said, there's 1.1 trillion to be avoided there. Breaking that down for, I suppose, the real experiences for businesses and communities. For as an example, in 2013 and 2014, during bouts of particularly damaging flooding, the average cost to a UK business was about £82,000. Now, that was those that were majorly affected by that flooding, and again, that's from the National Audit Office. So these extreme weather events will be much more frequent in the future, and that is, I suppose, a warning for business that the more that is invested now, those savings can be realised later through cost avoidance. Go ahead, John. Sorry, go back one.
There you go. Sorry, Sean.
Yeah, you're okay. You're grand. So some of the health benefits from intervening like this, right, in the short and the medium term as soon as possible. For every £1 invested in energy efficiency measures, right, within retrofitting a home, the NHS can save 42 pence. That amounts to an annual saving of 1.4 billion in England alone. That's through, I suppose, decreased pressure from air pollution or from respiratory diseases, from, I suppose, cold or leaky homes. And in human terms, and it's important, although we try to focus on some of the economic dividends that might be available through climate action, there are real human terms to this. And the Royal College of Physicians estimate that some 340,000 life years have been lost as a result to preventable air pollution. So making air in city centres and town centres cleaner is a real benefit, clearly for people's lives, but also for the economy by way of energy efficiency and savings for the NHS. So now, related to that sort of air pollution, that congestion in city centres, we found that about £968 per car within city centres is the average cost to the economy due to congestion every single year, or that totals around 11 billion that is lost in lost productivity, lost worker hours, damage to the local environment and so on from major in-town congestion. So, as I say, totaling about 11 billion a year in some estimates. Now, the solution to that is obviously active travel, because we'd see now that transport is the major emitter within many local authorities, with over half of them, in fact, it's the largest emitter. So that £1 million of investment in sustainable transport infrastructure can create 12.7 full-time equivalent jobs in the UK economy by some estimates. So that's the multiplier that's available there. By £1 million investment in X local authority, obviously it'll alter significantly. There can be up to between 12 and 13 jobs created, the full-time equivalent. Let's get that out of the road. So similarly, for every kilometre then that's invested in greenways and cycle paths, 1.5 full-time equivalent jobs are created. So again, a massive significant benefit for local employment at a time, particularly coming out of COVID. These are good jobs that are rooted in local areas. Commuters who opt to use cycle lanes instead of clogged up choke points in urban centres take half as many days off as others, resulting in a boost again by another estimate. So you're looking, I suppose, at the first point there, but the other way around, resulting in a 13.7 billion boost to the UK economy, equivalent to about £36 million per local authorities. So the way, I suppose, some of these figures can be quite staggering, but this is, I suppose, our point by some estimates that if these investments are seen as an investment in the future in better quality of life and in safer and cleaner towns, then these are the benefits that are available on the long run. So, as I say, the land use was another major point that we looked at, and related to that then is nature-based solutions. Now, part of, as I said, is yes, let's land loose in more rural local authorities, but also within urban local authorities, the role of afforestation is absolutely critical, and we have a number of eye-catching numbers related to that. So to try and put, I suppose, wheels on the bus there, at a scale of afforestation recommended by the Climate Change Committee, so they recommended that up to 30,000 hectares of woodland should be afforested. That level of capital investment, right? So we used multipliers provided by the Royal Society of Protection of Birds. That level of investment to produce 30,000 more forested hectares would generate 366 million in value added, or at about 1 million value added per local authority in the UK. Again, an analysis of the government's Nature for Climate Fund, which would plant about 40 million trees, shows that this would create about 36,000 jobs in nature-based solutions across the UK. So again, some of these eye-catching figures, socially, economically, and by way of health, for the role of trees in afforestation and nature-based interventions within cities. So 10 to 50%, there's an increase of respondents to this survey. So there's an increased willingness to spend on products while in the presence of street trees in central business districts. So we all know a wee bit more hospitable to be around. There's an increase in restaurant patronage. So again, more people spending more time in city centres and the high streets, which are already high pressed. They've noticed an increase in commercial trading, an increase in a willingness to pay for products where there are significant green cover, and also, I suppose, significant park visitors from local businesses and that as well. So staying with the nature-based solutions, an estimate of the economic benefit per tree, okay, so per tree invested or I suppose installed within town centres over 50 years, over a big chunk of its lifespan, could range between 1.2 thousand to 8,000 pounds per tree invested in. So I suppose that's being realised from some of the economic benefits we just discussed on the last slide, by way of making business districts more hospitable for consumption and so on, but also by way of flood mitigation, by groundwater stores and so on. So you're taking a massive infrastructural chunk out of that as well by using natural infrastructure, in other words, trees. So consumers are also willing to pay 9 to 10% more for goods in shopping areas where there are significant trees, and also significant presence of trees. And we've also saw that where there is a 10% increase in tree canopy cover, there is a 15% decrease in violent crime and a very similar decrease in property crime as well, even controlling for other socioeconomic factors. So again, trees are major social and economic benefit for local authorities. So again, now we're looking at the domestic side of things, having gone through the nature-based solutions and the land use. If sufficient investment across the UK was committed to retrofitting UK homes up to at least the C level of energy efficiency, which is what's recommended as a bare minimum by the Committee for Climate Change, then some 150,000 jobs could be created across the UK. Now, in the report, we have a regional breakdown of where some of these jobs might be based on the level of energy performance certificates of existing housing stock, which was quite interesting as well. Similarly, property values benefit from an increase in green spaces in towns and cities. We noticed there on previous slides. Studies show increase between 5 and 18% in property values in greener or more forested streets. So we talked about sort of productivity and efficiency measures that could be realised by businesses. Well, investment in building energy efficiency measures across local authorities totaling about 8.5 billion could deliver additional economic benefits of over 92 billion. So again, it's that short-term investment in retrofitting can lead to greater productivity and cost savings from reduced fuel consumption down the line. It is estimated that UK households could save about 7.5 billion in energy expenditure every year. And so that's the sum total. If there were greater and more insulated homes, this is the sum total of savings in energy bills that could be realised by households, which again creates, I suppose, a demand factor for local economies is what we're looking at. So as I said, this is the regional breakdown for those jobs in the construction sector, particularly that could be generated by greater investment in energy efficient and insulation measures. Next slide, John. So some of the case studies, we pulled together about 4 or 5 case studies for this. So Leeds was interesting because there was a mini Stern report produced by the Leeds Climate Commission. And like most of the climate commissions that take place in some of these cities, for example, Belfast, in which John is heavily involved, what they, I suppose, produce is a roadmap to net zero within those areas, but looking at the reductions that are required to do that, but the economic benefits that can be realised by pursuing those emissions reductions. So we can see that by among the policies could reduce the city's energy bill, this is Leeds, by as much as 277 million by 2030. This is focusing on insulation and boiler retrofit. So again, a major focus on the domestic element. Well, that's equivalent to about 17% of the city's 1.6 billion income. So that is a major saving which could generate additional demand and multipliers across the local economy. And that's equivalent to about 327 quid per person. And then more ambitious end of those investment decisions that could be pursued could see up to 392 million by 2030, or about £460 per person. So again, this is about scale and ambition, and the benefits can match the scale and the ambition. Local investment in these more ambitious approach could create up to 26,000 additional employment years. So that's years but spread across a number of different employees, equivalent to about 650 jobs specifically over about 40 years from 2030. So taking a look at Belfast then as well, where there's a fairly high emissions per capita relative to other cities. And a major part of that is that it's a very poor housing stock. So you'll see in 2018, Belfast domestic sector was responsible for 543 kilotons of CO2. And Pecan research points to the insulation of buildings as similar to Leeds and these other climate commission spots as the most effective targets for carbon reduction. Now, that is also, I suppose, the most effective because there are easier wins there, as we talked about in the initial slides. Those are the most effective avenues for economic benefits and realising those. So again, targeting the built environment and retrofitting and more efficient heating systems and so on could create over 700 jobs in Belfast in the city and save the city 283 million a year by 2030 by way of energy expenditure. Again, back to that point, that is money that is leaking out literally of the local economy and could be reinvested into high streets and small businesses and social enterprise and so on. So again, looking at, sorry, John. Just finally, then looking at the more ambitious element of that is if you wrap up that investment, then there's even greater savings and greater employment opportunities. And I'll hand over to John.
That's great, thank you, Sean. And now for something completely different or slightly different. So Sean did a lot of work on kind of. I appreciate for those of you listening, there's a lot of facts and figures, the benefits. I mean, the take home from what Sean was saying is that investing in green infrastructure, green and blue spaces, nature-based solutions, planting trees, retrofitting our homes, certainly moving away from coal, oil and gas, it pays for itself, particularly not just in terms of some of the, interesting figures about an individual tree having such an economic uplift, but also on the health of our communities. The blighted lives often in low-income, working-class communities, particularly in Belfast, living in very badly insulated housing. And what I'm going to do in my the section of the report is looking at, well, what might be the economic and political models and policies and frameworks and indeed vision. What's the vision we want for our cities and communities as we make this journey towards net zero? So you'd be delighted to know this is the bit that I probably had most to do with in the report. I'm not going to go through each and every element of it. I'll just pick out some that I think are significant. And I appreciate this is at a very high level. It is a UK-wide based study, although as Sean indicated, we have done some case studies. And this section here is that kind of, I don't know, you might want to call it horizon scanning. It's looking at the new ways in which particularly local councils and indeed citizens and politicians are going to have to start thinking, because the existing policy-making process at the local level is not working, and the scale and the pace of decarbonisation, of dealing with climate breakdown, will mean that we're going to have to try new experiments in how we, retrofit homes, new economic models of procurement in the public sector, but there will also be requirements of national level changes, and particularly in terms of how the Treasury assesses projects and so on. So, this kind of stating the obvious is that the reasons why we were focusing on local councils was that's what UK100, they're based around local councils pushing forward this agenda, but also that this is where the climate battle will be won and lost. Yes, what's going on over in Glasgow at COP and so on, it is important to a degree, although in my own view, and I'm happy to be corrected by the end of the week, I don't think anything significant is going to come out of it. It's going to be at the local level where people can see they have an impact, and I think that community innovation, that community involvement is going to be absolutely vital, and not just because community involvement is a good thing, but often the solutions are there in local communities. It's that old shoe pinching argument. It's only the person who's wearing the shoes that knows where it pinches. Similarly, the solutions are often in the room, in our communities. But the other thing is, we need to get people on board with this, to support and indeed be demanding stronger climate action as opposed to resisting it. And this is one way of understanding the role of the local council. It goes out in like a concentric circles. It can directly control its own transportation fleet, its own buildings, but then right out to the bit I'm talking about here, the green bit, in the sense of involving the community much more on a participative manner, and not the usual consultation stuff that we get often in Northern Ireland, but elsewhere, where there's a kind of a passive, almost grudging involvement of the community by statutory agencies. My own view, and you'll see this, I'll be mentioning this toward the end, is that in the report we suggested that what we're facing now is akin to wartime mobilization. It's code red for humanity. One of my public health colleagues here at the university described it to me very evocatively. He said, the planet's in ICU. The planet is seriously damaged and it's getting worse. And that's not to say, I don't say that to frighten people, but that's just what the science is telling us. And therefore we need to start changing quite rapidly, and we're going to need to bring our communities with us. Otherwise they will slow down and they may resist and reject any climate action, particularly if they see that's going to make their lives worse. The whole point in all of these is, as Sean pointed out, is to realise the multiple co-benefits of climate action, so that people can see their lives, the lives of their kids, their communities are being improved, rather than the opposite in terms of moving away, particularly from a carbon-based energy system. But national government will have to do a lot of the setting out the direction of travel, and particularly the issue of fairness is going to be really important. Now, it's something we flagged up in the report, is that the watchword should really be equity, not equality. In other words, even though the UK government, for example, has set a target of net zero by 2050, doesn't mean to say you just disaggregate that down to each local authority area and that Belfast has to carry the same burden as Birmingham. Think about it this way: for a rich borough in London, where people are living very high carbon lifestyles, they're got 2 and 3 houses, they got cars, they're living very high consumption lifestyles, and they have the wealth. Equity would suggest, now people can disagree, but one issue is to say that, well, rich places across the UK, they should carry more of a burden of the transition, and not working class communities or areas that are suffering from deindustrialization in the north of England and so on. Or to think of another way of the equity issue comes into play, as Sean already mentioned, Argyll and Bute has massive capacity to store and sequester carbon due to its lowly, it's got a low population density, and it's got plenty of natural cover and forest and so on to sequester carbon. that should mean that maybe it should carry a higher burden, because it can, of, say, nature-based solutions. If the government sets targets for, a certain, quantity of trees and nature-based solutions, well, we need to start thinking in terms of like a matrix, that it's not just, one issue. You got to look at wealth of an area. You got to look at the land use, the assets, and that way I think we begin to see that not every part of the UK, or every part, I would even suggest, is, in each society, is going to go at the same speed. And the clearest example of it is in terms of class. Why should poor working class people who may be in, climate vulnerable areas, in case you didn't know, about 27%, the highest proportion of our houses in Belfast are in low income areas. And yet these people often don't have the capacity to move out of the area. Often their lifestyles are fairly low carbon, just because they can't, afford a lot of, 2 cars flying away and so on. So I think there's a big issue. We need to ensure that it's a just transition, that, those particularly on low income are not going to be disproportionately affected and negatively affected as we make this transition to a net zero economy. One model which I'm particularly excited about, and we had an event about this at the university last Wednesday, is community wealth building. And this takes inspiration from Preston in Lancashire, of a new, I've called it here, a new municipalist movement. It's about relocalizing the economy, and also about trying to use the public sector's procurement in terms of creating, for example, worker cooperatives, democratizing ownership and control of the local economy. And they started to do this already in Preston. So it's not about working at the national level in terms of nationalization of parts of the economy. It is about, in small tangible ways, local councils using their budgets, and Belfast City Council has a very big budget, that it can move its supply chains. But it's also about working with what's all in the American context, where community wealth building has also been developed. It's called the EDS and MEDS model. So EDS is education, places with universities, again, public sector, big organizations. They employ lots of people, they use lots of energy, they buy food, and so on. The MEDS is medical side. And of course, in case you didn't know, Belfast Health and Social Care Trust is the biggest trust in the UK. It's an employer of thousands of people. Much like the university, it is consuming and using lots of materials, energy, water, food, and so on. And if you were to add in the Belfast Harbour Estate, TransLink, Belfast Metropolitan College, University of Ulster, in those public sector organisations, never mind the police and the fire service and the ambulance service, which you could add in as well, if you add in all the public sector, what's called anchor institutions, they could, and it's something that we on the Belfast Climate Commission are actively now going to be looking at, of getting those big public sector organisations to work together and say, well, how can we use our enormous spending power to create new markets, to demand, for example, that all the businesses supplying to us are living wage or even better employers? Can we not consider breaking up maybe some of our procurement needs so that small firms can bid? That's the problem. The structure of the Northern Irish economy is that over 90% of it is SME sector, small medium enterprises, and they cannot bid for a multi-million-pound procurement contract to the NHS or Queen's to supply them with electricity or food or whatever else, computers. So I think there's something around being smarter. So it's not about extra money, that's always useful, of course, but it's about saying, are we using our public money to the best effect to help our community, and particularly to ensure that we're decarbonising across all our supply chains? And this is not something that's just abstract. This is already happening in places across the water. The one that's probably most famous is Preston, and they've launched their Community Wealth Building 2.0 earlier this year, in seeing that the social value, and there is a social value clause in Scotland, and I think there is one being proposed, I correct me if I'm wrong, it might be Conor Murphy or I don't know whether somebody from Sinn Féin is proposing a social value clause in the Assembly, so that you would be able to include in your considerations of the public spending of money, not just value for money, is it the cheapest and high quality, but is this employer promoting human rights? Is this employer, paying a living wage? Is this employer recognizing trade unions or whatever? You can include in that social value clause quite a lot of non-strictly economic benefits, and that would then help create the catalyst for these businesses then to change to include ecological considerations, to decarbonize their activities, because you can say we as a university are not accepting food that isn't grown locally, that isn't grown to the highest, limited pesticide, that the workers are being paid a good wage and whatever. So the contract could be set, and that would drive then innovation further on down the supply chain. That's the issue here. How can we use that public procurement budget in terms of spending to mitigate and reduce climate risk? It's also then happening in Scotland, in North Ayrshire, and there you can read it there yourself, where they're making an explicit link between this new council-led municipal model of development and using its power in terms of, as an employer, social value in terms of procurement, to directly connect it to relocalizing the economy. Because when you relocalize the economy, that already has a benefit in making your economy less climate risky, because there's no longer long carbon footprints on the things that we're using. It also, by the way, means that your economy is more resilient and it's less likely to be negatively impacted by shocks. I mean, just consider how at parts of the pandemic, or even indeed Brexit and the impact of the protocol, supply chains have been affected here in Northern Ireland. It's because when you are dependent upon resources and goods and service from outside your territory, any disruption in that supply chain then means you're vulnerable. You may recall, for some of us, the early part of the pandemic might be known as the Great Toilet Roll Famine, when there was a terrible shortage, certainly over and seeing the Newton Abbey from the online video. But that's just an example of, as you relocalize the economy, it becomes more resilient, and essentially you're enhancing the security of the economy. Think about it. Part of the reason why we're now suffering, or our communities are suffering, is that energy prices have skyrocketed. In terms of the price you're paying for oil and gas, we have to import those oil or gas products via a private company, whether it's Firmus or Phoenix or whatever. They're buying it then from a wholesale market, which is coming then either from Russia or Saudi Arabia or whatever. Imagine if much more of our heating needs, for example, in our houses, were either retrofitted. As Sean mentioned, the benefits of retrofit are, I think, brilliant. But if more and more of our heating was to come from electricity that we're producing locally, well, that would bring the cost down. We wouldn't be dependent upon long supply chains of fossil fuels. So there's another benefit, if you like, of this green transition, which hopefully is a direct economic benefit and material benefit to our communities. So this relocalization is the main way in which we can see that mitigation will be delivered through community wealth building. It also creates more jobs locally. This is a little bit technical here in terms of helping us deal with consumption-based emissions. So most modelling, including the report that Sean mentioned that the Climate Change Commission here in Belfast did, we were only looking at the emissions that were based in the territory. So emissions from in Belfast in terms of what we're making or what we're producing in terms of energy. We are not including all the Chinese imported goods or Spanish wine or whatever it is that we're bringing in. And that's a big issue in international climate politics. Where should that land on the carbon budget? Is that Spain, because the product is produced in Spain? Or is it, as I would tend to agree, and many of my colleagues would, but that should be on Northern Ireland's carbon budget account. It's about including all the carbon impacts of the things, not just that we're producing and so on locally in our territorial area, but what are we bringing in? And that's where it gets pretty scary in some degree. If you were to include all our carbon emissions, the carbon emissions of Belfast would be enormous. And this shows you the scale of the challenge, particularly for the global north, particularly because we're net importers often of very high carbon goods, but we've not done that modelling yet. But it's something, again, on the Commission that we would like to do. And I think the more we relocalise the economy, where we're not, okay, I doubt a wine produced in Culibaki will have the same taste and so on as a wine from Spain. So not everything can be, locally produced, but quite a lot. And we've actually seen that in a strange way with the protocol, that quite a lot of local new innovations have happened, where I think I'm happy to be corrected that whether it was Marks and Spencer's or Tesco's or some big store like that were getting their sandwiches shipped in from GB, and then we had the whole problem with issues at the Irish sea border. Well, they just simply repurpose their supply chain and are now, as I understand it, getting their sandwiches be made locally. Well, that's just, I'm not saying, this is no particular comment on the protocol, but to show you the ways in which we can pivot our economy and relocalize it, create local jobs. We also keep the money in the local economy, in terms of what Sean mentioned, in terms of the very important multiplier effect. So how do we then finance this transition? Because we're talking, Sean mentioned some pretty eye-watering figures in terms of what we're going to be needing in terms of investments in the infrastructure and so on. We're talking in the trillions, not just in the billions. Where are we going to get this, particularly for local authorities who are already suffering from austerity, particularly over the last decade or so? Well, we do have sources of capital, one of which is the pension funds, particularly from local authorities. And there's an example from Lancashire where often pension fund managers are trying to get the highest return, to pay their members who are pensioners and so on. And so they often are investing outside the economy, whereas actually, it makes pretty good economic returns, as well as then it has these other benefits that are, investing in a local area. If you invest your pension fund in the local economy. And that's why it's sad in a way, to say the least, that NILCSOC, that most of you probably wouldn't have heard of, is the Northern Ireland Local Government Pension Scheme. It's not investing in Northern Ireland. The New York pension scheme, funnily enough, is investing in Northern Ireland. You can say, why isn't our local pension schemes investing here? Why isn't our local banks investing more here? And not just in terms of green mortgages, which if you go around the city now, you'll see, I don't know, it's NatWest offering, green mortgages. And I think that's all going to be part of the transition. But also, what are the banks doing to provide the capital to invest locally? Or, that quintessentially Irish, Northern Irish phenomenon or an institution, credit unions. There's an enormous amount of money, often raised by working class people who put money, away, and then, other members of the community then borrow from it. Now, there are some legal constraints as to what they're able to do, but I think they could be changed so that, credit unions are investing in local climate action to create jobs, keeping people, in energy warm homes, and so on. And this is, if you ever, and it is an issue we often immediately go to, where's the money? There's always a problem with where the money is. And I'll talk in a moment about, from a national level perspective, there is no shortage of money for the UK, and I'll explain why. But here's some, eye-watering figures. Another one, 4 billion of investable wealth. That's not as a whole. That's per 100,000 people in the UK. So you would have scaled that up to whatever it is, to 60 odd million or more now people in the UK, and you begin to see the level of the wall of capital that is there available. But the problem is that people are investing outside their communities, investing in global stocks and shares, and so on. And so the whole point here is that the transition is about inward. How do we turn that investment that's currently going outside the UK and outside our communities? How do we turn that inwards and use that investment to upgrade homes, build green and blue infrastructure, more greenways, and all the other aspects of what a particularly urban-based green transition will require. And this is where we can look again across the water. We have on the Commission, the Belfast Climate Commission, begun kind of dipping our toe into this and trying to identify, in the same way that Manchester and Bristol did. And effectively what Manchester and Bristol did, they kind of looked around their areas and said, okay, where's the investable opportunities in terms of, cleaning up rivers, investing in retrofit, green energy production, and to provide what's called an investment prospectus, so that you have a list of investable project in your city or your city region that you can then go out to try and get private or public-private investment to say, well, invest in Belfast and you get this return for retrofitting houses, for example. And so we've already seen this is the way cities are moving, and I think the most exciting certainly is Bristol, because they've been the first to kind of do this, but also I wouldn't rule out Manchester's interesting model, and there's one that we can learn from in Belfast. Just to begin to wind up, because I'm sure you're probably punch drunk now with all these facts and figures and suggestions, is there is a big problem in the UK, but it's not particular to the UK. You'll find this in most European financial departments, the Treasury, is that the current way the Treasury makes decisions, let's call it the Green Book for those of you who are interested. It's basically advice it gives to the public sector about spending and making assessments about, should the public sector invest in this and so on. Is that it's not measuring what's done. Is that its current decision-making methodologies are inappropriate for the low carbon transition. And therefore, one of the recommendations in our report is that it needs to update for the age of climate breakdown and the climate transition. It needs to make quite some significant change in how it actually assesses, public spending. Because at the moment, effectively, what would be good from a climate point of view, what would be good from a human health point of view in terms of a public investment, that doesn't add up for the Treasury, because they're only looking at the bottom line. What's the economic return? And they're not actually looking at, well, what's the savings to the health service, as Sean mentioned. The Royal College of Physicians have, given some really fantastic, figures as to what could be saved if we improve air quality and we retrofit homes. But the Treasury doesn't count that. It's only looking at the single bottom line, where what it needs to do is to include these other considerations of the risks that are avoided, the benefits, and the reduction of the burden on the NHS as on the positive side that we should be including in our public policy decisions. I won't read all of this. The last point is the important bit, this multi-criteria analysis. So at the minute, the Treasury is only focused on the bottom line, the economic return. So it's a good spend of public investment if we invest £1 and we get back £1.10. Bada bing, bada boom, the Treasury is happy. Whereas actually what we would say is that the investment is not including that even if an investment, for example, only returns on the bottom line 90p, the Treasury says, we're going to be losing money. But if that same investment was to basically remove a burden on the NHS of 20p, that would then get us back up to the £1.10. But the Treasury is not looking at the saving to the NHS, which seems crazy in a way, because you'd imagine that the government institution like the Treasury should be looking across all the benefits and costs. And that's what we're making here, this claim. We need these multi-criteria. So use a number of criteria in order to judge what's a good spend of public money. And the last thing, folks, is what I say to you is that your taxes pay for nothing. This modern monetary theory is, for me, an understanding of how state finances work. The state is not like a household or a business. Just think about it. For us listening on this call tonight, if we want to go and buy something, we have to either borrow it or we have to earn it in some way. So we have to get the money and then spend it. The government finances does not work like that, although that's how we all think. Think about even now with the concerns about the government debt, and we're going to have austerity to pay for all the pandemic spending. That is ideological, in my view, according to this modern monetary theory, or what's sometimes called functional finance. As you see there, the bit of underlined is that there are no constraints on what a government can spend except the physical resources in the economy. But also think about it yourself in terms of next time you hear, particularly, John Campbell of the BBC here in Northern Ireland, or some other economic commentator going on about the debt is terrible. Logically, if the government is in debt, that means that the non-government sector is in credit. Just logically, where's that money gone? And it's something that's never really asked in our public debate. It's all going up the debt is a bad thing. And, you know, debt in a common sense term has a kind of a negative connotation. But no one's ever asking, well, if the government is in debt, who's benefiting? Ideally or logically, the government's debt is our surplus. If the government is spending on us, that's money that we now have, the government doesn't have. And the government does not need to raise taxes in order to do this. It creates the money through spending. The only constraint on the government is the actual resources in a society. So the ultimate way in which this modern monetary theory works, which I think is really important as we think about the climate transition, is we need to be looking at all the assets in our society, the land, our people, the factories, the machines, the science, technology. They're the things we should be concerned about, not the money. Whereas what we mostly focus on, partly for ideological reasons, particularly in terms of right-wing politics, is to focus on the debt, because the debt means we can't have all the things we want. Have you ever noticed why there's always money for war and not for the NHS? That we could go to war in Iraq in 2003, suddenly millions of pounds were simply created to pay for the men, women, munitions, and so on. But why can't the same logic be used for the NHS in terms of investing in something that most people would probably say is more socially useful? So essentially, just this is a slide which just kind of puts in words what I've just said, is that essentially we should balance the economy, not the budget. We're fixated on this monetary focus because the media and our politicians are focusing on this. There's a whole other reason as to why they won't accept what I'm presenting here. This would be rejected by most politicians, you know, in many respects. But to me, you know, I'm not saying this because I'm an academic. I've looked at it. I thought it was counterintuitive as well. I am satisfied that this is how the state's finances work. It is not like a household. The state does not need to raise money before it spends. The state cannot go bankrupt. It can go into debt up to a very high level so long as it's within the constraints of the real economy, the assets, the land, the capital, the factories, the science, technology, you know, the skills of its people. They're the real issues we should be focusing on, not necessarily on the debt. And there's a nice quote. It's actually, I think it's from John Maynard Keynes, the great English economist. If it's technically feasible, so in other words, if it's physically possible to do something, it's financially affordable. Whereas we got it the back way around. We say, oh, no, we can't afford it, therefore we can't do it. And therefore we're denied decent housing for our people up to the highest energy standards. Therefore, we're denied moving away from carbon energy as a result of state investment. We're denied decent public transportation, again, because we're not looking at the resources in the society. We're only focusing on, in my view, this ideological view, which is the focus on money. And just to finish, you know, this is a way in which there's an appeal in the report that we've put out that we should really be having at least conversations about this alternative view of how state finances work, and that really the issue is not necessarily finding the finance, it's the political will and demands by citizens, by local authorities, by political parties who get this, to be demanding the state to use this enormous power it has, this enormous capacity to spend money, to mobilize resources, to do lots of great things that we need to do, rather than, as we see at the moment, there's this sense, oh, we can't afford it, or we're going to have to do it in a piecemeal manner. Whereas for me, to go back to, you know, that wartime mobilization, do we really think Winston Churchill sat when he was looking at the, you know, the invasion of Britain about saying, well, can we afford it? All he was looking at was, have we got the resources, you know, the munitions, the factories, the men fighting on the front lines and the women growing food in the fields. They're the issues that the British government used to fight the war, not the finances. It got into an enormous amount of debt to fight the war, which only was paid off about 6 or 7 years ago. Big deal. The state can carry a high degree of financial debt so long as it has the physical resources to sustain that. And so for me, it's about looking back in part to see how, you know, how we operated during the Second World War. And we can provide the money that local councils need, because local councils are what I call here the nimble fingers, and they're connected to citizens. But we do need the powerful thumb also of the state. in terms of, you know, big spending on, you know, transportation, the energy system, the electricity infrastructure. These are things that are often beyond the capacity of a local government. So it's a combination of both. But the issue, folks, is it's not the lack of money. That's not the major constraint. There's an ideological block on that being used by government. And that's why I definitely think that we need to, well, I do, others may disagree, that, you know, we are in a wartime situation. You know, we need to see that, you know, our recent experience with the pandemic, I think that gives us a real sense of what a real emergency looks like. You know, even though we've had lots of declarations of climate and ecological emergencies, you can say, well, big deal, nothing's really happened. The pandemic is what a real emergency looks like. The Second World War is what a clear and present danger looks like. And that's why, to go back to Keynes, he argued in the Second World War that while nobody wanted war, you could use war and that wartime mobilization as a way, in what we would call today, of building back better. You know, he's a much more fancy way of talking about a snatch from the exegesis of war, positive social improvements. In other words, to use the negative out of the war to build something better. Like the NHS grew out of the Second World War and the devastation of that. So similarly, as you come out of the pandemic, we need to be doing something similar. So the argument here is that we need to use local governments, but not to see them necessarily being constrained by the lack of money, because the money is there. Again, money always there for war. Why not then for the climate emergency? Money was there to pay for PPE and furlough workers during the pandemic. Why not now in retrofitting people's homes, as they've done in Italy? In Italy, folks, the government will pay you 110%. Yeah, you heard me right. Not only are you going to pay 100% of the cost of retrofitting, putting up solar panels, heat pumps, or whatever it is, they'll also give you a reduction on your taxes over a couple of years to incentivize. That's what we need, that level of state-backed finance, the certainty that people can invest in their homes to retrofit them at no cost or very, very low cost, rather than what we have at the moment. You know, this piecemeal approach, like I mentioned the green mortgages. Well, who can afford a green mortgage where you can get a cheaper mortgage if you put loads of, you know, green tech in? That's beyond the capacity of most people. You know, that assumes also you own your own home. But also it's about seeing that, you know, Boris Johnson's plan that he released 2 weeks ago of the net zero carbon roadmap. You know, the issue that came up in the media was £5,000 grant for heat pumps. That just ain't going to cut it. You know, that may help those who can afford that investment in you know, in their homes of, you know, 10, 15,000 pounds just for heat pumps. You know, it's calculated that to retrofit our homes, it's between 20 and 40,000 pounds per house. That's what we're looking at. I'm relaxed, as you say, because I believe in modern monetary theory, the functional view of finance. The government has this money that it can use, and it can make sure all our businesses and indeed our communities are energy safe. But of course, what's blocking it, I think, is people power. So I'll leave it there, and happy to take any questions or comments.
Yes, really fascinating. And you know, you're preaching to the choir here in terms of including the community voice in these conversations. My question is, in the plan for the Belfast agenda and the Belfast forward, is there a focus on community voices in that plan? Do they intend, from what you've seen, to engage with local communities around the transition in Belfast?
Being honest, in the plan that we've produced, the net zero carbon roadmap, that was very technical, just looking at the auditing the greenhouse gas emissions. So in that report, no. My own firm view is that there's absolutely no way we can manage this transition in Belfast or anywhere else without engaging communities, because my fear is what's behind you on your chair, Jacqueline, is known in France as a gilet jaune, or a yellow vest. And as Sean knows, because he's done some work on it, in France we had the example of an unjust transition which slowed down the whole thing, because they imposed a carbon tax or a diesel tax on people, and that's what led to the yellow vest movement in France. You can imagine something similar here in Belfast. If we start we, by the government and the council and so on, start initiating green transition policies which make people's lives worse, it just won't work. And that's why I'm so disappointed with, as I say, Boris Johnson, the government's proposal that it's about providing people with little bits of grant and they have to pay a lot of money themselves. That is not going to work for the vast majority of people. And what it will mean is, and I'm speaking against myself, is that I'm a very well paid university professor. I have an electric car. I can afford to pay for green renewable energy. I pay an extra tariff. I have solar panels, but I'm privileged. That is not the model. But my fear is that's the model that's being proposed. Individuals are going to do this themselves. Whereas my view, I'll be honest with you, I'm not saying I'm not speaking now on behalf of the Commission or anyone else, but I'm a socialist. This is where the state has to come in, as it did in the Second World War, and build thousands of houses, initiate a massive, retrofitting campaign. That's why I think the retrofit for Northern Ireland is the ideal one, because that's where our biggest challenges are. And we also have the highest levels of fuel poverty. So that's just my own view. I'm not necessarily saying that will be shared amongst others in the Belfast Climate Commission, but that's my own strong view. This has to be a state-led transition that takes the pain out of this for ordinary people, that they can see the benefits almost immediately. Because there's no point in trying to sell this agenda on saving the planet, because as somebody said to me ages ago, it's not about the end of the world. For some people, they can't even think about the end of the week, never mind the end of the world. So how do we connect this then? That's the key issue. So absolutely, Jacqueline, I'm going around the houses here. It will have to involve our local communities, because what I might think as an academic or as a member of the Belfast Commission that's right for East Belfast, in terms of me looking at the figures that I get from NISRA and BAYS, which is the Department for Business and Energy and Industrial Strategy, that's where myself and Sean got a lot of our data. I may get a view of what I think East Belfast needs in this green transition, but that may not fly with people locally. They may have better ideas. So I do think it's about that combination of top down and bottom up. So for me, we're only at the start of the journey, and our initial starting point is simply to get some of the empirics, get some of the baseline data, but then we have to add people and their desires and aspirations and their criticisms. This should not be seen as somehow, well-meaning experts telling people what to do. And that's the worst, way of going about it, is to say that maybe even though what we've provided may make ecological sense and climate sense, it has to make sense for people in terms of their aspirations for their local community and them and their children's lives. I don't know whether, Sean, you've got anything else to add on that community dimension. We can't hear you, Sean.
I think I'd learned it already at this stage. Now we're only 2 years in. No. I mean, John's covered it, like many of the broad strokes there as well. But like even from an economic point of view, involving community in the decisions that are supposed to realise all these great economic benefits, right, that we were talking about at the first half of the presentation. Involving the community in deciding what those projects will be means also that the economic benefits will be realised in real time, because they've decided, look, this is something that we've said our community needs. So, for example, one of the case studies that we looked at was Staffordshire Moorlands, right? So near the British Moors. I'm not very familiar with the geography of the area, but quite very rural. And what they had done was three, I thought, fascinating local projects. They decided through consultation with the community to significantly green local. They used a disused rail line and turned it into like an active travel network, right? A cycle that connected three towns that would be isolated by a motorway. The community said they wanted that done, and it was done, and now it's used. They planted 40 orchards, community orchards that are owned by the community and now feature all sorts of community events and all this sort of stuff. So anyway, long-winded point of saying that because the community had identified these projects, now they're reaping the benefits by way of well-being and so on, as opposed to policymakers maybe looking at what we've put in this report and saying, oh, excellent, we can do the sums now and we'll get X amount of value added to the local economy. involving people in what those projects are, I suppose, is the critical element of it,
Maybe just to back that up and to give other people a chance to think of a question or a comment, is that what we need to do, Jacqueline, and partly it's to do with COVID and partly to do with the fact of time, and it's like everywhere else, we don't have enough resources and people. The presentation, not this one, I wouldn't say, but the one that we have on the net zero carbon roadmap for Belfast, to give that to local communities in East Belfast and maybe try and get a little bit more detail and say, well, what do you think of this? And then to hear back with them and say, yeah, dead on, go for that. We think that's great. Or say, hold on a minute, we don't like that because what's going to be the impact on this area? If you want to grow a load of trees over there? No, you can't do that, because often these statistics don't give you that fine, as you know, they don't give you that fine-grained analysis of real people with real issues, with real struggles, and that's what we need. And again, I go back, I'm a bit like a broken record, and people have criticized this framing of it. I think it's that sense of, listen, folks, we are in a wartime situation here. Now, it's not like our troubles, and maybe that's the danger of using that language. And some people say, well, maybe it's not even like the Second World War, but we have a clear and present danger that's going to affect. We can already see in East Belfast where storm surges and sea level rises are going to have a direct impact. I mean, never mind, if anyone's listening, they're thinking of buying a house, don't buy a house in the Lower Roma Road. Or before you do, look at Rivers Agency flood maps and so on. We're already seeing this. And for me, it's about, what is that dialogue with the community? So you can get a local community action plan that people have had their input, and not the usual consultation that passes for democratic involvement, and to see, well, could this be a really exciting way of involving the community, and to see that there is something positive in all of this, because often the green, transition is either seen as a woke, middle class, guilty, urban, educated, and it is for a lot of people. It's organic avocados, it's buying hemp bags and things that are just outside the price range of most people. And there's a big challenge then to translate that into what I would call a working class environmentalism that makes a difference to real people's lives. Like free public transport, for me, makes economic sense. We have free Wi-Fi. Well, why not free public transport? We have public transportation free for our OAPs and some other categories. It actually makes economic and climate sense to have a much more, not just more efficient public transportation system, but for certain routes you make it free, as they've done in many other cities. That brings real benefits to people's lives. And particularly then, the issue that Sean mentioned a few times, the amount of jobs that we could create in this area, not just in East Belfast, but in the whole green transition space. To me, coming up to the election, if Jeffrey gets his Christmas wish, the election might be before Christmas. I don't think so. It'll probably be next May. Is to be asking people to consider, when someone's rapping your door looking for their vote, ask them if this issue that we're discussing tonight is of importance to you, or at least some of it. Asking them, well, what are you going to do about this? This should be an issue that drives. Our politicians should be biting each other's hands off to be the one that champions the retrofitting of houses in Northern Ireland. I think that has so much popular appeal. I'm really surprised that we don't see much more public debate about it. I think it's that fear. Oh, where are you going to get the money? It's that kind of what I would call that household view of public money, which again, as I said, I don't accept, but others clearly do. I don't know whether Sean, Brendan, or Ashley have a comment or a question. Or have we beaten you all into submission? We've hammered you over the head with statistics and new ideas. This is the bit that most people fall down in interviews, folks. If you're ever going for an interview, always ready yourself for the kind of awkward silence. That they are usually strategically introduced to get you as the candidate, because most of us don't like awkward silences, and therefore you say things just to fill, and sometimes you trip yourself up. So anyway, so in other words, I'm not bothered about the awkward silences because it's healthy. It shows people are thinking and so on. But does anybody have any comment or question you'd like to ask? Don't feel you have to make one up. It's absolutely fine. if people are interested in this, you can find, well, if you just Google search either Sean Fair and John Barry UK100, you get to the report. You can read it to your own, content. I'm more than happy, as is Sean, if you want to contact us afterwards about, anything that we said tonight, or indeed that's in the report. But we appreciate this is very heavy on a lot of statistics. The takeaway message is that there is so much benefit in this transition. We have to do it. There's no question about the science is really, really clear, but we should not enter into this transition to a low carbon, climate resilient economy and society in a grudging manner that we have to. We can fix not everything to do with inequality. We could fix some of it. We could certainly fix joblessness. We could certainly fix, I think, often a sense of hopelessness that many young people feel in this area. I mean, I was at the climate strike on Saturday, and indeed with my own students, you can see it. They're anxious about the future, and it's awful. And it's something that I think this is a hopeful message about all, that excitement that we're creating a different type of society. And I know that sounds incredibly, blasé and liberal, but I really think that that's the frame we need to present this to our communities so that they get behind it. I mean, people are smart, people, are practical, but they need to be shown the evidence. And I think we can show them the evidence about this is going to be the impact if we keep going the way we're going. It's not very healthy. Look at all these benefits that are possibly available. So I've just seen that Ashley has maybe put a, oh, thank you, Ashley. We're here to serve. So listen, folks, if nobody has anything else to say, we don't have to hang on any longer. Thanks for, sharing your time tonight. The reality is that there will be more of these events. As I keep telling people, just like a puppy is not just for Christmas, climate is not just for COP, and that really this is going to be a standard item, I think, in community groups, in the university, at city council. And if we can help in any way, shape or form, either in the academy, and it's something that I know Sean and I feel passionate about, is that we need to get academics more out into the community, to be helping explain these issues in a language that people understand. I mean, some of the language used tonight would be off-putting. If we were to present this to a community group, it's not about dumbing down. People are smart, but gigatons of carbon, net zero, all those things have to be explained to people. And part of what I think the process we're involved in now is we're all getting up to speed with climate literacy. We're all having to learn a new language of climate and of carbon. And I think there's something of an onus and a burden, good burden on publicly paid academics such as me. So for those of you involved in the community sector, I know like Jacqueline there, I don't know about the rest of them beyond Brendan, please do get in touch with me. And if it's not me that can help you, it'll be somebody else I can put you in touch with. Because again, to go back to the framing, we're going to need everybody together in this challenge. The state won't save us, folks. Technology is not going to save us. The community by itself can't do it. We're going to need everybody involved in this. We didn't even get into how, there's going to be a great role, I think, for the school system, for our young people to be educated on this issue. There's going to be, a role in terms of maybe changing our curriculum so that we're producing the skilled workers who are able to engage in the green energy transition or engage in apprenticeships in nature-based solutions. I mean, we're at the same scale and of the challenge that we went through about 300 years ago when we moved from a feudal agricultural society into a modern industrial urban capitalist society. That's what we're facing, and we're going to make mistakes. But I do think it's about honestly recognizing that, not everything that is faced can be overcome, but nothing can be overcome until it's faced. So hopefully we'll see you down the road at some other meeting like this at some point. But Sean, do you have any final words?
Not that, John. Just thank you for your time, folks, and for the opportunity to present. All
right, folks. Listen, take care. Go well. Mind yourself.
Thank you very much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Cheerio.
Bye-bye.